Right, I think we can start. We are 2 minutes past 3. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Resilience of Autonomous Systems seminar. It is a great pleasure for me to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Amanda Prorok, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and Technology at Cambridge. And the focus of Amanda's research is on finding new ways of coordinating artificially intelligent agents that are meant to achieve common goals in either shared physical or shared virtual spaces. Amanda is the recipient of a prestigious CRC starting grant and also the recipient of multiple awards, including from Amazon Research, the EPSRC, the Isaac Newton Trust, and from EPFL for her best EPFL doctoral thesis in computer science. She also serves as associate editor for the IEEE Robotics and Automation Letters and as associate editor for Autonomous Robots, two very prestigious journals. Amanda's talk today will be on communication in multi-agent systems, and I see she already shared her slides, so if you would like to start, Amanda.
Thank you very much, Raju. It's really a great pleasure to be invited to speak at the Resilience series of technical talks. So thank you as well for the very kind introduction. As Radu has already mentioned, today I will be talking about how to exploit learning methods to learn to communicate in multi-agent systems. The work that I will be presenting today has been done in collaboration with some of my students, Qingbiao Li, Jan Blumenkamp, Rupert Mitchell, Ryan Cordvellesi, as well as my postdoc, Zhe Liu, and also collaborators abroad, Fernando Gama, who is now at Berkeley and was at UPenn, and also Alejandro Ribeiro, who's still at the University of Pennsylvania. So with this, let's jump right in. So my lab's work is driven by this idea that the next wave of computing is all about the convergence of ubiquitous compute, communication, and AI. And this vision is really backed up by predictions that say that by 2035, over 1 trillion intelligent devices will be connected. So the thing is that communication by itself is not really enough, because I'd argue that it's really about the decisions that communication will trigger. And keeping this context in mind, my lab's research is really about developing the techniques that endow autonomous agents with intelligence that enables them to cooperate towards common goals. Now, my mission has many applications, and this is also mainly because we're increasingly deploying not just one robot, but connected groups of robots to solve tasks together. And extremely successful examples to date, you will recognize a couple of these, include logistics, transport, and agriculture. But I'd argue that this kind of automation also has been shown to be really promising out in the wild in much less structured environments. So we can think of, for example, environmental monitoring or monitoring in general in urban or rural areas, but also deployments in outer space, for example. And the key point here that I'd like to highlight is whether it's through simple coordination or through more sophisticated forms of collaboration, these systems tend to perform much better when there are several robots taking part in the tasks that they're trying to solve. And so again, to kind of reiterate this general idea, what we are interested in my lab is to figure out how to get these robots to work together. And the idea of binding in communication as a central part of these coordination schemes is really central to what we do. So what I'd like to start off with is a bit of an example of a system that we built in my lab a few years ago to demonstrate the need for good coordination schemes. So in this example here, we programmed these cars to run with a human-inspired driving behavior. So there are no explicit communications here amongst the cars. And we created this artificial bottleneck scenario by stopping one of the cars. And the idea behind this was we were actually interested in seeing how this bottleneck would affect the overall traffic in this little miniature highway setup. And so what you can see happening in this scenario is that as we stop one of the cars, a long queue starts to form behind the stopped car. So we really create a bottleneck scenario. And the reason for this is because the cars are not negotiating their way into safely merging into the outer lane so that they're able to overtake the stopped cars, right? Now, the main question that we were going to ask ourselves, or the aim that we set ourselves, was, can we somehow find a way to fix this problem? And so what we decided to do as a low-hanging fruit, essentially, was to basically go about designing a decentralized cooperative algorithm that was very specific to this very scenario. And we did this by handcrafting a communication policy and an action policy such that the cars would safely navigate around this bottleneck whilst maintaining a high throughput overall, okay? And so as you see this second version of the movie looping through here, you can observe how the cars on the outer lane now are very subtly slowing down to enable safe merge maneuvers from the cars that are stuck on the inner lane, right? So the insight here is that whilst such, first principles-based controllers seem to work well in practice, they are painstakingly hand designed. And although in this particular scenario, the result is very successful, the design method that we used here does not transfer to other problems. And there are also other issues with this kind of design method. And overall, we don't think that it's an effective way of going about solving the general coordination problem. So this now very nicely leads me to the core problem, which is at the heart of our research, which is the question of how to effectively communicate to coordinate amongst autonomous robots. Now, the good news for us is that this is a difficult problem. Now, why is this a difficult problem? It's difficult on the one hand, because most coordination problems cannot be solved in polynomial time. It's also difficult because as we decide to decentralize our systems, we need to know who to communicate, what to communicate, and when to communicate. And it's also difficult because it's not really clear what strategy to follow when things don't really work as expected, and when we start to rely on communication channels which may be compromised, right? So resilience comes in very nicely in this third pillar of the question, of the research question. And so what we can do is we can either think of tackling our problems with classical first principle-based approaches, or on the other hand side, we can think of resorting to data-driven approaches in the hope that these methods can generalize across problem types and also problem scales. And so today, what I will be focusing on, or the central interest or the central component of my talk today, will be on data-driven approaches. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on. So our research is guided by this overarching question of, can robots or can autonomous agents learn to coordinate? And this research agenda is really fueled by this very simple insight that robot relationships can be represented as graphs. And what this allows us to do is this allows us to exploit the structure of underlying data to facilitate the learning problem, right? So overall, what we want our agents to do is we want them to be able to learn what to communicate amongst each other. And we also want them to be able to make these decisions based on the messages that they receive, right? Okay, so I'm now going to walk you through the various components that lead to a machine learning-based methodology that contribute to communication for coordination. So to solve this learning problem, what we're going to do is we're going to build on a machine learning architecture that is known as graph neural networks, or otherwise referred to as GNNs. And you may already be very familiar with GNNs as they've been broadly popular within the machine learning community to model structured inputs. So we've seen them in the use within the domain of chemistry to model molecules, also within the domain of physics, for example, to model meshes for fluid dynamics. And very similarly, we're going to use GNNs as a proxy for our communications topology. So that's the analogy, the structure that we're going to be exploiting in order to use this paradigm of GNNs. And by doing that, we're going to be enabling the agents, which in this representation are the nodes in the system, to learn what signals they're going to be sending across the edges of this graph or of these graphs. And so what our GNNs do is they perform operations in a topological space that is then defined by agent neighborhoods. So why are GNNs interesting to us? So they bring us three key features that make them very attractive for our purposes. The first feature that is very attractive is that they're permutation equivariant. So what does that mean? That basically means that the same action is taken if the state of neighboring nodes with the same topology are the same. The second feature is stability, which says that if neighborhood topologies are similar, similar actions will be taken. And that feature is very interesting for generalization and transfer. And the third feature that is interesting to us is essentially the distributedness of the solution, which is enabled to us given the fact that the mathematical models that are describing GNNs are intrinsically decentralizable. So they can be locally executed and are distributed by nature. And this ultimately will allow us to execute algorithms on the robots, which is equivalent to node level processing. So these are the three features that really motivate us to exploiting and leveraging GNNs for learning decentralized policies, to learn to communicate, to coordinate. So I'm going to break down the narrative of my talk into three main parts. The first thing that I'm going to show you today is that we can solve very hard coordination problems by learning communication. But because communication can actually directly influence the actions that agents take, we actually have to be careful about how we set these learning systems up so that we're ensuring that the agent incentives are aligned. So all the agents that are composed within these systems. And in the second part of my talk, I'm going to be demonstrating this very example or this very case study in an example that elicits the emergence of adversarial communication and impedes cooperation among agents. And the last thing that I'm going to talk about is how we can actually counteract such adversarial communication strategies when they do arise. And I'll actually show you how to make this an integral part of the GNN architecture. So this brings me to my first research question, which is, can we automatically synthesize local communication and decision-making policies to solve hard coordination problems? And so what we're going to do is we're going to try to do this by deploying our graph neural networks. So the case study that we chose to do this, to analyze this research question, is the problem of multi-agent pathfinding. And we chose this particular application for two main reasons. The first reason is that it's an NP-hard problem to solve for both make-span as well as flow time objectives, which makes it a hard and interesting problem to look at. And the second reason that we chose this application is that optimal solvers do actually exist, which means that we can actually benchmark our solutions and validate their performance on problems that include small numbers of agents. And this is very interesting to us, especially as we're starting to pioneer this new research domain, right? So what are our aims in this? Our aims are twofold. The first aim is we're going to want to derive a local policy for every agent based on local observations and local communications only. So that is our first main goal. And the second goal that we have is we want to be able to reach performance that is comparable to what centralized near optimal solvers can do. Yet, because we are essentially running decentralized policies, we're hoping to have systems that scale much more gracefully than these counterpart benchmark solutions that normally scale exponentially in the number of agents n, right? So that's where we want to become an attractive alternative to these benchmark solutions. So how do we set up our systems? Well, what we do here, if we look at this little panel on the right-hand side, which is an example of a system of 20 agents, is we define the local observations that these agents are capable of making. So on the one hand side, we have, so if we focus on agent 4, for example, we have a local field of view that is shaded in green here, which shows that the agent can see any other agents in its vicinity, and it can also see obstacles in its vicinity, but nothing else. And that agent actually also does not have global positioning. Instead, it just gets a general direction of where it has to head into, which is given to it by a projection of the goal position, right? So that goal position is just projected onto the perimeter of this local field of view. And that is all that the agent knows about its environment. So no maps and no positioning. What the agent can also do is it can communicate with other agents that are in its vicinity. So here we're, for example, using a maximum communication range to define what other agents this agent number 4 can talk to. And that is all that we have at the get-go. Okay? So given that we now know what an agent can locally observe, how do we build a machine learning architecture around this assumption? So this is what our framework looks like from a very high level perspective. So the system in itself is composed of 3 main components. So the first thing we do is for each robot, we input a tensor that records local information. So in this particular case, we record local information in multiple channels. So one for the local observation of obstacles, another for other agents, and another one for the goal projection. This information is then locally encoded by a convolutional neural network. The GNN then emulates the communication by computing how that information is then sent and received among other agents. And that output is then fed into a sequence of fully connected layers. And the robot's motion decision is then the result of a final softmax activation over a couple of discrete motion primitives, right? So in this particular case, because we're considering the discrete multi-agent pathfinding problem, the action space is simply represented by movements up, down, left and right, or idle. So that's how we go from observation to a final action policy. So at this point, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to write down the model, the mathematical model for the GNN, so that in the next couple of slides, I can convince you that the parameters that we're learning lead to a fully decentralizable policy that can be executed locally and individually on agents without any global knowledge of the system. So this here, just to emphasize this, what I'm writing down here is the centralized view. And later I'm going to show you how these parameters that we're learning in the centralized description are actually exploited completely in a local manner. Okay? So here, if S is the adjacency matrix and X is a matrix that gathers the observations from all agents, what the first equation tells us is how an agent I is aggregating the information that is being sent to it over a number of K communication hops, right? The second equation then parameterizes this message aggregation by right multiplying the observations with a matrix H. And this matrix H here is our learnable parameter, okay? So G is then simply our communication function and theta sub 2 are its parameters. So in this particular case, we have a set of matrices H where we have one for each communication hub, right? Now, just to recall that 3-tiered architecture I showed you before, we also have a CNN and an MLP, and those are then parameterized by theta sub 1 and theta sub 3. And what we're going to do is we're going to learn the parameters of all these 3 models in an end-to-end manner within an imitation learning setup. And what we're going to do is we're going to be minimizing a cross-entropy loss function, which considers the optimal discrete actions that are performed by an expert algorithm and the actions that are executed by our policy. Right? So now that is both the architectural as well as the mathematical setup of our problem. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you how we then take these parameters that are learned and we deploy these systems so that the systems themselves then run in a fully decentralized and local manner. So let's first consider robot B here in this schematic. Now, what robot B here is doing, if we start on the left-hand side, is we're considering here the front-end system, which is the local observation. And what happens with that local observation is that it's encoded by the CNN and the parameters of which the robot B locally owns, right? It's carrying those parameters. And robot B then is able to produce a local feature vector, which is termed X sub B. At that point, robot B will then share this information with its local neighborhood. And this is then done for all three robots in this little mini scenario. So robot C does the same and robot C does the same thing as well. Now, if we now consider robot A will be receiving measurements X sub B and X sub C because robots B and C are in robot A's communications neighborhood. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to have a look at robot A, and we're going to discuss how robot A actually processes this information and how it exploits the parameters that we previously learned that compose our communications function. So you'll recall that my communications function G is learning the parameters H, which are indexed by the communication hops. So what we're doing now from the viewpoint of agent A is for all information that is incoming from various communication hops, the incoming information is simply multiplied by this matrix H, right, which are the parameters of the comms function. And this is then summed up across the hops and is then passed through a nonlinearity. And finally, what we do is we feed that information through fully connected layers, which then finally outputs the action, right? And so note here also that the operations leading up to the vector X prime could be repeated, leading to a multi-layer GNN. So in conclusion here, you can see that all the operations that actually need to be computed by the GNN are done in a fully decentralized manner. And this concludes the basics of the framework. So next up, I'm going to show you some movies that show you qualitatively how the system performs and shows you as well how our policy is performed comparatively to the expert algorithm that we use to train it. So as this movie loops through, what you're observing here on the left-hand side is our expert algorithm. And on the right-hand side, you can see our solution. So what I'm visualizing here is we're always focusing on one specific agent and its communication topology. So the solid lines are the ones correspond to one hop communication neighbors, and the dashed lines correspond to a two hop communication neighborhood. And qualitatively, what you can see here is that the agents follow similar paths and that the full system roughly completes at the same time as the system of the centralized solver, which is a good thing because we're showing that roughly our agents are as quick in their motion plans as the centralized expert algorithm. And importantly, what you can see is that in our solution, all the agents actually do eventually reach their goals. So we actually have 100% success in the cases that I'm showing you here, right? So clearly this is a qualitative overview, and what I'd like to do next is convince you of how well it does in a more quantitative fashion. So what we're doing here in these two plots is we're comparing our model with two different benchmarks. The first benchmark that we're considering here is the expert algorithm itself. And the second benchmark that we're considering is an alternative decentralized planner. So it's a discrete version of the very well-known famous ORCA reciprocal collision avoidance planner. So the ORCA algorithm is the decentralized approximate algorithms in blue, and our algorithms are in orange, green, and red. And then we have all the values here that are shown with respect to the optimal solvers. So what the left-hand plot is showing us is that the success rate for our best model is close to 100% as we increase the problem sizes, so increasing the number of robots. And on the right-hand side, we can see that this increase in flow time, which is the flow time basically tracks how quickly the robots are reaching their goals. With respect to the optimal solvers, so this increase remains very small, right? And one interesting observation here is that as we increase the number of communication hops in our network or in our model performance improves. Now, clearly we've tested our system here on relatively small problem instances. So you'll note that our x-axis stops at 12 agents. And the reason for this is that because we're computing these values with respect to the optimal solvers, and clearly these optimal solvers, when we run them in dense environments, they're computationally very expensive. So in the particular case of CBS, which is our expert algorithm, it does not complete its computations within the given time out of 5 minutes for anything larger than 14 agents. And in contrast to that, our GNN actually takes less than a second to solve these instances. And so this is a very interesting attribute because we're showing how our model has the potential to scale to much, much larger systems as long as we can generalize its performance to much larger problems. And so this is the question that we decided to follow up on in a subsequent piece of work. So what we're aiming to do in this piece of work is to test how well we can actually really generalize to much larger systems, and to what extent we actually lose optimality as we do so. So what we still want to do, however, is train on small instances, right? For which we can efficiently run our machine learning architecture that depends on an expert algorithm, right? And with those models that we then trained on very small problem instances, we then want to be able to test them or execute them on much larger instances of say hundreds or even thousands of agents. Now, the challenge in actually doing this is in understanding how to deal with potentially large amounts of incoming information. So what we decided to do in this next piece of research is, in addition to learning these communication parameters, so the GNN weights, we also are learning attention weights given to us by the matrix E here, which is nothing else than a function of ego and incoming information. And so essentially what we're telling our network to do is to try to learn a pattern when to pay attention to which communication partner, and thereby find out what information is really critical to the motion planning problem, right? And so what we do then in quantitative evaluations is we compare a vanilla GNN, so in red here, to this attention-based alternative, so the blues and greens in these two plots. And we test this on instances that are up to 100 times larger than instances that we trained our problems on. So this is really a significant generalization of the setup of our problem. And what we can see here is that indeed our attention-based mechanism seems to perform much better as we scale to these much larger problem instances. So in summary here, one of the key insights is that we can use expert algorithms that are expensive to run or to execute, but use them to train our models on very small problem instances, and then use that learn policy to solve much larger problem instances more efficiently than we would be able to do so with the expert algorithms. Right? So that is the main insight that we've gained from these research studies. So following up on that, here I just want to show you that we can also learn policies that perform in the continuous domain, not only in the discrete domains. And to facilitate this, what we did was actually develop a more general GNN architecture that enables more generic application agnostic ways of setting up the learning problem. And so here what we're seeing the GNNs do is we see them in action after having imitated Reynolds flocking, for those of you who are familiar with flocking paradigms, on simulated quadrotors. So the Reynolds flocking algorithm allows us to copy or represents an expert algorithm, which allows us to copy this template behavior in order to learn a model behavior that allows robots to follow a leader robot in a flock. And so what you can see in the movie here is on the left-hand side, the expert, and on the right-hand side, qualitatively very similar behavior where robots are locally running these GNN-based models in order to follow the leader robots. Right, so this concludes the first part of my talk, and I hope I've now convinced you that we could solve hard coordination problems with GNNs. And now what I want to talk about is the actual importance of setting up the right incentives to our multi-agent team if we want them to cooperate. Right? So more specifically, what we set out to study next was whether agents were actually capable of learning communication strategies within a reinforcement learning setting. So in such a setting, making sure that the goals of all agents are aligned is really crucial, especially because the communication strategies that we're learning directly influences the agent's actions. And so for this particular problem, we considered the task of cooperative coverage, where agents are essentially tasked to cover an area as quickly as possible in a joint manner and exploit coordination to do this. Right? So in more detail, in this particular task of cooperative coverage, we're interested in seeing the agents jointly decide who goes where to cover a given area as quickly as possible. Now, we consider two different problem types. So on the one hand side, we have coverage in a simple cluttered environment where the obstacles can be distributed in any random way, so convex forms and shapes in here. The second scenario that we're considering is the split environment, where agents start off on the left-hand side, but their coverage only counts on the right-hand side of this environment, right? So they have to learn to move into the right-hand side and distribute evenly over the right-hand side of the split environment. So because we're training our agents in a reinforcement learning setup, we reward each agent for covering any new cells, so any cell that has previously not been seen by any other agent. And the key thing is that we look at a setup with two distinct teams. So that is going to be the crucial design feature of the system, where each team of agents has a distinct set of parameters. Now, it's key to remember here that all the agents still have the same reward function, which is simply to cover a new cell. So how do we set up this problem a little bit more formally? And so you'll see here in this problem formulation, it's very similar to the previous one, in that we have, again, three main components. So we have a function f that encodes observations, a function g that represents our communication strategy, and a function h that outputs our final action. However, different to before, we're actually formalizing the graph neural network so that each agent team can learn its own set of parameters, enabling heterogeneous communication policies. And an agent then has a policy pi, which we're going to improve through a policy gradient with the classical goal of maximizing its cumulative rewards. Now, the key here is that we're going to make explicit that the actions that are taken by other agents affect the reward of each individual agent. And we're going to make it explicit that there are essentially two teams operating with two sets of parameters. So here denoted by theta superscript c and theta superscript n. And so our goal is to analyze how communication strategies evolve as we update the policy of one group of agents whilst we hold the other group's policies fixed. Okay, so this is what we're going to do in this study. Now, we went about doing this, and what I'm going to show you in the movie is the agent teams running these policies at the end of training. Okay? So on the left-hand side, you can see the example where all the agents were trained simultaneously, sharing one joint set of parameters. So the red and the blues were trained together. And on the right-hand side, you can see what happens when the red agent was trained whilst the blue team's policy was fixed. Now, what you can see happening is on the left-hand side, the agents are roughly equally covering new cells and sharing the coverage load. Whilst on the right-hand side, what you see happening is that the red agent tends to cover much more new cells than the blue agents do. So in other words, it's essentially reaping a much higher reward than all the blue agents are, right? This kind of behavior also scales to much larger systems. So if we again train the red agent's policy while holding five blue agents policies fixed, we can just take that very same policy and execute it in a much larger system. And you can see how that same communication policy enables the red agent to manipulate a large team of blue agents to essentially restrain their exploration to the bottom half of this environment, right? So the red agent is very effectively keeping the blue team's policy in check, right? And it's impressive to me that this policy, or this adversarial communication policy that is learned by the red agent, scales to very large teams of blue agents. Now let's have a look at this a little bit more quantitatively. So what the top plot is showing you here is the average return per team as training progresses. And about 1/3 of the way through training, what we're doing is we're fixing the policy of the blue team and we're allowing the red agent to learn. And what we can see here is that the red agent is able to learn a manipulative communication strategy that essentially allows it to reap a higher return than the members of the blue team. And what the bottom plot is showing us is the return as an episode progresses, averaged over 100 runs. The solid lines show the values for the policies that we obtained at the end of training. And as a comparison, the dotted lines are showing us the values when we don't allow the red agent to communicate to any other agents. And so what we can see here is how the communication has a significant impact on the actions chosen by the agents. So now what we're interested in doing, or at the time, what we were interested in doing, was in trying to understand what was going on. So we were interested in analyzing the messages that were being sent by the agents to see whether we could actually gain some sort of insight into how this manipulative behavior was actually occurring. And so what I'm showing you here on the top row are the ground truth coverage maps for individual agents. So this corresponds to their local observations, so what agents know about themselves. And the bottom row shows our post hoc reconstruction of the messages, so the communication messages that are being sent by the individual agents. And so on the left-hand side, we see both of these components for the red agent. On the right-hand column, we see both of these components for the blue agent, for a blue agent. And what we observe here is that there is a very high agreement between the ground truth and the sent message for the blue agent on the right-hand side. But there's a very low agreement for the red agent. And in fact, what this particular example shows is that the red agent seems to send the blue agents into areas that it has already covered. And conversely, it's communicating that area that it has not yet covered has already been covered, right? So you can see that the area it's communicating is very misleading and very manipulative towards the red agents. And so we deduce that it is through some sort of lying strategy that it seems to obtain its advantages over the blue agents in this system. And so this now brings me to the third and final part of my talk, which is all about me showing you how we can actually attempt to counteract such adversarial communication strategies when they do arise, and how we can actually embed such protective measures into our GNN architecture. So the key question that we're considering here is how to provide robustness against faulty or potentially even adversarial communication so that cooperation can still be achieved. And so let me talk you through this case study on hand of a very simple example where we have this little panel image on the right-hand side that illustrates it. So here you could imagine that we have a team of drones where each individual drone could be individually be trying to classify what it is that it is observing underneath, right? So jointly, these drones are clearly observing an aeroplane, but we want every individual drone here to be making that conclusion. And an individual drone is going to be doing this by integrating messages from their neighbors. So the neighbors should be telling their other neighbors, their other agents, what they are seeing, and together we can piece this together to make an estimate of what the overall picture is representing. And so you can imagine here in this toy example that if any of these agents communicates misleading or faulty observations, the classification that any drone would be making locally would be wrong, right? And so this is what we want to overcome. So what is our idea? So our idea here is to be able to filter messages according to how confident an agent is about a message's validity. And so the trick that we're going to be assuming here is that agents know something about their relative positions to their neighbors. For example, because they can simply visually detect their neighbors. So for example, if agent I here has an observation of agents A and B, then it knows something about roughly what these other agents should be observing and whether or not these messages that are being sent to it are by any means plausible or not, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to use this information to build a model that characterizes the mutual information between agents, given that they know their relative positions. And this model is then used to compute posterior probabilities, in other words, a confidence weight, that then tell us whether a communication partner is being truthful or not. And so the final step here is then to include that confidence value in an attention layer that is added to the communication model. And this confidence value then simply, or the hope is that this would then allow us to suppress the influence of suspicious communication on the receiving agent's decision, right? So C sub j here is really this confidence value that we're using to multiply any incoming information that is given to us within our GNN layer, where you can see the elements of the adjacency matrix S sub ij here and H sub 1 here, which is the first layer of our communications function for layer number 1 as a function of incoming features F. Right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to now exploit this idea and execute it on the example that I showed you previously. So coming back to our cooperative coverage example, we simply execute, so we train a model given the fact that we know relative observations of our agents, and we then use this filtering mechanism to see what its impact is on the case when we have an adversarial agent that was trained in absence of the blue agent's policy being trained as well. And so you can see here on the bottom plot, when we're using this filtering mechanism, you can see that we're able to counter this issue of misaligned agents. Whereas we again have a misalignment or a strong advantage of the red team versus the blue team in the top plot, which is when we're not using the filtering mechanism. So what we're essentially showing you here in a nutshell is that when filtering is active within the GNN layers, the distribution of the coverage among all agents is uniform, and we achieve a much fairer distribution of the workload, and the reward is also much fairer distributed among all the agents. Right? So this now concludes the third part of my talk, and I just want to summarize what I've been speaking about today by giving you a couple of take-home messages. So the first thing is that GNNs really facilitate the learning of distributed policies in multi-agent systems. These learned policies provide scalability at little performance cost. And this is something that we have quantitatively observed in the case studies that we've considered thus far. But we've also discussed how the learning process itself needs to be very carefully designed so that we have successful cooperation that emerges from the ensuing communication patterns. And finally, there is still hope, because we also know that robustness can be directly embedded within these GNN architectures in the case that we have faulty communications arise. There are a number of things that we're still very excited about in my lab, and I didn't have much time to talk about various other aspects, but I just want to highlight 3 little points here before concluding. So the first aspect really leans onto the topic of explainability and interpretability of policies, where we're really aiming to achieve, or where we have this ambition to achieve an interpretation that goes beyond post hoc interpretation, which is what I showed you today, that relies more on models that are really intrinsically interpretable, and we know something about what they're actually providing us with. The second topic I'm excited about is fairness, which in other words could be simply considered as an alternative optimization objective, which could be exploited, for example, to ensure or assert more fair distribution of workloads amongst agents as we're facilitating cooperation or coordination through these emerging communication patterns. And the final thing is sim to real, which in my opinion is one of the key and most crucial aspects of any forthgoing research topic, since this will ultimately allow us to deploy any of these ideas from our systems that have mainly been tested in simulation into actual systems that we can run in the real world. So with this, I would like to thank my team, many of which are depicted in this relatively recent screenshot here. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank reviewers and also supporters who are often anonymous, as well as all my funders for whose support I'm very grateful, and without which support I would not be able to be doing all the work that I do together with my lab. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be more than happy to take any of your questions at this point.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for an insightful talk. This is very interesting. Any questions for Amanda? Did you want to ask your question, Tony? If you can switch your microphone on. If not, Colin?
Hi. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting stuff. And I've obviously got some reading to do about GNNs. Not too au fait with them, I'm afraid. You made some suggestions at the end about how you might deal with confidence in adversarial communications. I wondered if you thought more widely about ability of agents. I'm thinking there of the fact that they're not necessarily adversarial, they're just not very good at certain things. So if you've got heterogeneous agents, learning to understand what they're good at, what they're not good at, and why their communications might be reliable.
That's such a good question. Yeah, thank you for that. I'm a huge fan of the research topic of heterogeneous multi-agent systems. And it's actually very dear to my heart. And we've been working a little bit on that. But moving into the area of actually discovering heterogeneous capabilities on the fly is actually, so it's actually really interesting. And it's interesting for the reason because we cannot build on a priori models that we've built that make the assumption that we're essentially dealing with homogeneous systems, right? So this is our default kind of design paradigm, right? We're working in a system that is homogeneous either in terms of incentives or of capabilities. Now, what we need to be able to do as we move into discovering heterogeneity on the fly or online is learn those skills by observing what other robots are actually doing, either by observing something that is observable through communications or observing their performance directly, right? So I think that those are the two main ways that we could go about this. Clearly, what this would mean as a consequence for us is that we have some sort of closed loop control on the communication that we're running, right? So as you observe what other agents are capable of, you will be fine-tuning your communications patterns as a function of that quantity.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really cool question. I think that there are two main ways you could go about this. Clearly, could be data-driven, which you could then try to use. So if you go the data-driven approach, you could try to include that into, architectures that build on what we've done before. or you could go first principles, the more a first principles approach, and then kind of not use the whole GNN based kind of architecture that I've presented thus far. So I think you have to, there is a bifurcation in the path, which way you want to kind of decide to do, but I think the common denominator is that there has to be a closing of the loop on the communications.
Yeah, I was thinking as much as anything else about the fact that if there's somebody you don't trust and they tell you something, you may go and look yourself to gain further information. So it becomes a reinforcement through, if enough people tell you the same thing, then you've got almost consensus or an outlier.
I hear what you're saying. So there are two things, right? So either you go and look yourself, which is, I would argue, similar to what I suggested before, which is essentially you are kind of making your own measurement of the performance, right? And then you're fine-tuning your model of that agent's performance, your internal model, right? Or you're mentioning the idea of redundancy, which is actually similar to what I presented in the talk, in the sense that there we were assuming that we had mutual information, right? Which relies on redundancy in the sense that I need two of you guys to have consistent or coherent relative observations and measurements amongst you, so that I can filter out a third party saying that that guy is not coherent with respect to all the other guys, right? And then I automatically know which player is not playing according to the rules, right? So redundancy plays a big role as well. And actually redundancy is also something that we've actually shown in some recent research papers to be a fundamental contributor to robustness in various different ways, right? And ultimately, unfortunately, there's never really a free lunch with resilience or robustness. So you'll have to decide where you're going to spend your energy, right? Either it's in the system configuration, as in redundancy, or it's in compute, as in, you know, closed loop control and additional measurements of what is actually happening.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Great questions.
So, Amanda, a question that I have is related to the assumption underpinning the types of learning that you described, namely that agents have very little or no initial knowledge of their environment. So I can see this being very useful in many applications, but in yet other applications, there is knowledge that could be imparted to these agents to start with, including when the agents already learned very well the environment, but something changes. Is that something that you are
I think that's a great question
on?
as well. I maybe have two comments on that. So, I mean, the thing that we did here by going fully decentralized and fully local was clearly a design decision. It's not that I'm a proponent of fully decentralized systems, because I actually think that hybrid systems are the most powerful. If you have centralized knowledge, why not use it? And especially with communications architectures or networking systems that we're starting to build today, I definitely see us being able to exploit a lot of centralized information in the near future, right? However, if now we're talking within learning realms, the more you actually embed centralized information such as maps and all that kind of information, what you end up having is a decrease in the capability of transferring to other problems and scaling and generalizing your systems to other applications, because you're essentially embedding very unique information, right? Because that's what centralized information is. So if you think about it in the multi-agent pathfinding problem, a local field of view is essentially a pattern that an agent will encounter many times in its lifetime. However, a global snapshot of an environment is unique. That is one map, one warehouse, one forest, one field, and it exists once. So if you start training your systems with this kind of unique centralized observation, you will find that they tend to perform less well as you start to push them into other application domains, or into like pushing them into distributions essentially that they haven't encountered during training. So I'm actually saying here that designing your systems in a local manner might be beneficial if you're going the data-driven route.
I wonder if there's a case there for considering that central information body as another agent, which maybe we have some reliance on originally until we learn better about our local environment. So it's almost a hierarchical approach there, that you say we have a central communication that is viewed as being our best information so far. And now as I explore this area, I realize I'm more of an expert in this area than the central communication.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so kind of a sliding mode kind of control analogy might be conceivable.
Well, I was thinking again back to human-centric, you know, and we end up with this idea of somebody at the center who understands everything perfectly, and then as we become trained up, we start to be, we still hold them in high regard, but maybe we start to realize there's things that we know better. So we would hope it becomes more distributed over time.
Yeah, I was also thinking of a seeding of the agents with this initial information, because why would they start from nothing if some information were available? Tony, are you ready to ask your question?
Yeah, I had a couple of sort of related questions regarding the pathfinding demonstration. So it seemed on the first sort of demo of the results, the sort of communicating agents were sort of very sort of in one sort of grouped little area, and there was some agents which were passing very close to each other, and it didn't seem they were communicating. Is that because only some were showed, or is that because their sort of view projection was so narrow? Or
yeah, I think so. So that's probably got to do with how we visualized it. So the communication is fully defined through a disk model, which in that particular case just says if you are closer to anybody, if you are within a certain range to another agent, you will be communicating with that agent, right?
Okay.
So any agent that falls within that disk will be a communication partner. And in the visualization, we just actually focused on one agent out of the 30 or 40 and showed the two different disks for that specific agent, just because it would have been too cluttered otherwise.
Got you. And then also for the sort of scalability results on that, as you sort of approached a very high number of agents, it seemed the success dropped to 99.8%. Is there any way you can do some sort of trade-off to maybe, because you said the algorithm was within sort of 1 second, would there be any way to make it, to ensure that it stays at 100% success rate?
So I think the trade-off doesn't come at runtime, it comes at during training. And it's really about it's really about specialization on the problems that you're going to be feeding the solver or the model at runtime. So the more data you give it during training time, the more likely it is it's going to be able to solve the encountered problems. And we haven't quantified that trade-off curve exactly, but it's not compute time at runtime, it's during training.
Okay. And one final question. So you're currently using a centralized system as a sort of benchmark, but obviously these don't scale too well as they only have one centralized node. But is there no systems which use sort of multiple centralized nodes sort of split across the region, so they would potentially scale a little better than one with just a single centralized node?
So there's been an enormous amount of research on suboptimal solvers that approximate optimal multi-agent pathfinders. So eCVS is one of them. So you can actually tune the suboptimality level of the solvers, and you then have a guarantee within which bounds your solution will be suboptimal. So that's something you can do, and as you increase suboptimality, you're getting closer and closer to computation times that are then tractable for whatever problem instance it is that you're considering. So yeah, to answer your question with perhaps a more broader view. So multi-centralized is maybe one way of thinking of solving the problem, but you should look into the literature of actual of the researchers who have actually tackled approximations to the multi-agent pathfinding problem. And you will find that there are a lot of very powerful solvers out there.
Okay, thank you.
But maybe something else that I wanted to ask is related to the work on mitigating adversarial behavior. Do you think this would scale to multiple agents that are misbehaving?
Great question. So I think that's a super cool question, and because it brings in this aspect of collusion amongst adversarial agents. You know, it's very unsatisfying, but I'm going to say it depends, right? So I think it depends on, I mean, we haven't explicitly trained models for that case, but if you know that you have colluding agents, then this is something that you would have to bake into your confidence weighting, so the model that produces the confidence weight, essentially. What I can say is, so essentially the way we did it actually in that scenario is one of the final stages of the computation of this confidence weight is within, we actually do a hypothesis evaluation of our model to compute these likelihood values. And what we simply do is we have these neighborhoods, say if we have, 3 other agents in my neighborhood, what our model is internally computing is it's making the assumption of every single possible combination of 1 adversary, 2 good guys, and then it's moving that combination around the full multi-agent neighborhood configuration, essentially, right, combinatorially. And if you say, I want to consider the case where I actually have 2 colluding agents, then you're just adding another another round of computations to that, right? So you could say, okay, what would the measurement look like if I have then 2 colluding agents and just 1? And then you're shifting that around the system, computing all the possible combinations of that. What that observation would look like would have to be trained or modeled. But there's no reason we couldn't do it. So the actual mechanics of the way we do it allow for that idea.
Right, thank you. So maybe a comment as well. I think that this has been touched upon a little, but I'm increasingly seeing that, this approach in which agents carry on with their goals and exchange information perhaps needs to be generalized, and the collection of information itself should become a first-class citizen, in the sense that at some point the level of uncertainty in the system could be so high that agents might very well stop pursuing their main goal and switch to collecting more information, even if maybe they don't visit any new cell in your example. Is that something that you've seen maybe considered in research projects in general in this area?
So that's an interesting question. We haven't considered it at all because we haven't considered the problem of online learning. So everything that you've seen here thus far is really thinking about offline, so experience gathering, so training the systems offline and then executing policies at runtime at deployment, right? So we don't. Yeah, so I think that's what maybe you're kind of touching on. Yes, it could be an interesting question. I think so. In the reinforcement learning setting, it's a little bit different. I think that maybe in the multi-agent pathfinding problem, it depends on what you can afford. So if you actually have an environment and you say you have a warehouse and you want your robots to start heading to their goals, how much slack do you have to actually allow those agents to gather data or have some sort of guidance that tells them how they're doing whilst they're still learning their policy? So maybe it's essentially a question of how much the system designer can afford in terms of time and effort to do these things online versus trying to just, use the data sets that they have given and run and execute the policies when you're encountering the actual task.
Right, right. Yes, I'm asking this because I'm aware that humans sometimes behave in this way. So we may well have our paths planned, but when something doesn't go according to plan, or we are highly uncertain about what to do, we switch to this information harvesting mode.
I think fine-tuning of policies is something that should be considered a little bit more, I think, overall. So you can definitely be running a policy, but if you have some sort of way of measuring performance, then that automatically gives you an opening to using that data that you've collected throughout execution of the current policy to maybe try to improve it. So yes, that's definitely something that should be integrated into systems. I think maybe the only kind of final point I'd add to that is, if you're doing this kind of fine-tuning of policies online, and you're actually then also running the newly fine-tuned policies, you want to make sure that you trust those policies, in the sense that since they haven't been verified, at least in simulation, how do you know that your robots are not suddenly going to start doing something very awkward? I think maybe that's kind of the final thing to consider.
Can I just ask a question following on from that? So the environments you're looking at are fairly fixed and abstract, are they, in these cases? I know you've done some work with real world robots as well. I wonder if my question is about the nature of the message passing. How precise are those messages? How much do we have to say? So for example, I have visited this area. On a grid world, that's fairly easy. I entered this cell. That meant it was visited. How do these techniques vary when we're starting to say, I inspected a cell, where the level of inspection is maybe something that is a lot more tricky to quantize or abstract in that sense? Have you any thoughts on how that might work? So I can imagine, for example, a search and rescue with collaborative robots, something that's often talked about, where going into buildings says, I have inspected that building. But obviously,
I think the observation is totally flexible. You as a designer, you can design, you can specify it in whichever way you wish. So in our particular case, it was simply, it was indeed a grid map where cells were either covered or they weren't covered, and that was what was then encoded locally and sent out as a message. But you could imagine having an observation that is probabilistic, or I think I was in this cell with a certain confidence, and that's then what you would encode and communicate out. But I think that the overall qualitative behavior would still be exactly the same. We've actually done this particular coverage example. We've started running trials in the continuous domain on actual real robots, and nothing much really changes. I think the much more difficult issue to tackle is this assumption that in simulation, we're running communication in lockstep and it's totally synchronized. And that is clearly something we don't have in the real world. Right. And the GNN is sensitive to that. And so that's where we think our systems fail or might fail. And that's actually what we're trying to, kind of model better and understand a little bit better and see how we can get around those eventual issues.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any final question? If not, I would like to thank Amanda again for giving this insightful seminar and for answering our questions. And also I would like to thank everyone who attended, asked questions, participated in the discussion. I'm looking forward to seeing you again at our next seminar in 2 weeks' time.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.